Hello, my name's Florence. Welcome to the theobspod. I'm an NHS obstetrician, hoping to share some thoughts and experiences about my working life. Perhaps you enjoy Call the Midwife, maybe birth fascinates you, or you're simply curious about what exactly an obstetrician is. You might be pregnant and preparing for birth. Perhaps you work in maternity and want to know what makes your obstetric colleagues tick, or you want some fresh ideas and inspiration. Whichever of these is the case, and for that matter, anyone else that's interested, the theobspod is for you. Episode 89. Birth Time. There's a film, Birth Time. I'd seen about it on social media. There had been local screenings. I'd been invited, but actually they'd clashed with what I was already doing. I saw people commenting that the film made them cry. It made them full of joy. It made them see what birth should be. And I thought, maybe I need to have a look at this. So in the new year, when I saw it was possible to stream Birth Time and watch it anytime in the comfort of my own home, I thought I would take a look, find out what it was all about. So yesterday, I watched Birth Time. And today, I'm going to share with you some of my thoughts, some of my reflections. These are purely personal, but this is just how the film resonated with me. The film asks us the question: what would it take for all women to emerge physically well and emotionally safe from their births? Obviously, that's what I aspire to achieve every day. Day in, day out. Maybe that's naive of me. But that is why I get up and go to work every day. I don't go to work to traumatise people. The film was made by 3 Australian women: Jerusha Sutton, Jo Hunter, and Zoe Naylor. So for a start, listening in the UK, I needed to get myself into the Australian context, which shares some similarities with the UK, but some important differences. They looked at the fact that in Australia, 33% of women describe their birth experience as traumatic. And 66% of this trauma down to coercion by healthcare professionals. Now, if you're a healthcare professional listening to this, that's an almighty smack in the face. It makes you think, glug, what am I doing? Setting out, caring for women and ending up with that outcome. That's devastating to know. In some aspects, I don't think watching Birth Time was as traumatic for me as it might have been if I hadn't already read Birth as a Rite of Passage by Dr. Rachel Reed. And I've discussed reading that book and my feelings following it in episode 54, Environment. And indeed, since then, I've had the privilege of joining Rachel and her colleague Katie James on their Midwife's Cauldron podcast. So the idea of coercion by healthcare professionals wasn't entirely new to me. The beginning of the documentary is quite harrowing to listen to. Interviewing women and their partners. Some of the comments really stayed with me. one of the partners described being a spectator, being helpless, in the way, being told to sit in the corner. Not really how we'd want someone to be treated during the birth of their child. The most upsetting comment for me came from a woman who said at the moment of her child's birth, all she could imagine in her head was, I survived you guys being the professionals looking after her. And another woman described withstanding the doctors. They discussed the idea of medical safety trumping emotional safety. And that is something I can unfortunately see happening even in the best maternity units. We're very fixated on safety. And by that I mean physical safety. We're worried about hemorrhage for the woman. We're worried about stillbirth for the baby. And we do tend to put that to the forefront rather than thinking about emotional safety. I totally acknowledge that. For me, I think the film probably raised more questions than giving the answer to the aspirational statement at the beginning of the film. Some of the concepts I found very interesting. There was a discussion about pain and the idea that if we medicalise childbirth, we medicalise pain. And in medicine, pain is associated with disease and pathology, something going wrong with our bodies. And that pain in labour is actually a functional, physiological pain. A bit more akin to if you ran a marathon or did a hard gym session. I found that a very interesting idea that I hadn't previously thought of. I must admit, I have thought of differences in pain and whether pain is different if the labour is obstructed from whether the baby is travelling down the birth canal through the pelvis with effective contractions. But the idea that pain relief comes about because we're equating that with pathological pain, pain related to disease, was a new idea for me. I was very interested in the Birthing on Country project, which was talking about birth in Aboriginal communities, bringing birth back into a cultural setting and a societal setting. This sounded like a really interesting idea and something that I definitely think in the United Kingdom we could benefit from looking at. We've got disparity in outcomes. We know we've got inequity in some communities, particularly those from Black and Asian backgrounds. And if we put back birth into those communities and understood those communities and enabled those communities to have more of a voice in their birth setting and their birth and pregnancy care, would that help us get rid of some of that inequality? There was a lot of talk in the film about fear, and I think that some of this fear also comes from a lack of a cultural setting. Birth is an integral part of life. Birth and death are inevitable for us all, and we've totally disconnected it from our everyday lives. One of the things that most touched me during the documentary was actually during some of the videos of home births, watching the reactions on the siblings' faces. There was one small child who watched as the baby emerged, was birthed by their mother in the pool, who had this look of absolute awe on their face. This child was a toddler, and went, wow. And that joy and awe and respect for birth in a small child, we've totally lost that. We're taking birth away behind closed doors. And that wasn't the case in just one of the films we saw. It was the case in several of the films we saw. And if our children were more exposed to birth as a normal part of life and part of the circle of life and part of the life of our community, then would there be less fear associated? We tend to shield our children from birth. We don't allow, in inverted commas, children to come into our hospital obstetric unit. And why is that? We're deciding it would be traumatic for children. Actually, maybe we're traumatizing by hiding it from them until they're grown up, and then they're traumatized because they have insufficient knowledge and understanding that this is a normal thing and it's okay and it's what our bodies are designed to do. So I found that very interesting. There was a lot of discussion around patriarchy and feminism, and we do, it's true, live in a patriarchal society, and this couldn't be more evidenced in the UK than the fact that Leslie Regan was our first female president of the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists only in the last decade. All the previous presidents have been men. If we are hoping to care for and nurture and build healthcare systems and training and support for doctors working in that specialty, why is the power and the powerful positions still a male-dominated area? The discussions around misrepresentation of information and use of evidence to coerce women into doing things, I'm very familiar with. It's something I've discussed on my podcast before, talking about things like guidelines and statistics. The language we use and the way we explain things to people has a fundamental impact on how they understand it and the decisions they make as a result. If we're honest with ourselves as healthcare professionals, we know if we frame things one way, a woman's decision is likely to be one thing, and if we frame it an alternative way, her decision is much more likely to be that way. I couldn't help worrying with some of the discussion that we could worsen trauma because there were so many amazing births shown and the power of women and the strength of women that one almost could be made to feel that if one tried hard enough, if one batted off the doctors, one could definitely have that birth that you wanted, and you just had to fight hard enough and work hard enough. And I found that personally very bittersweet. When I had my own babies, which I've talked about in detail in my 2 motherhood episodes, I knew a lot. I was working in the system. I had done antenatal classes. I had done optimal fetal positioning to get my baby in a good position. I did breathing and relaxation techniques. I had done absolutely everything to try and give myself a positive birth and the best outcome. And I think one of the reasons I was so traumatized when I then needed a cesarean birth was because I felt I'd failed. I had not done enough. And I totally accept that it was actually the system had failed me by making me come in and have an induction and have Syntocin on and then pressing an epidural on me. But equally, I don't want to feel inadequate, because if I'd tried just that bit harder, I could have had that amazing home birth in a pool. I don't know that I could have done. And for women that do need medical intervention, a lot of them already carry a lot of guilt. So we need to proceed carefully, I think. Indeed, one of the women in the documentary did comment, "I prepared as much as I could, but I still had 3 unwanted cesareans." There was a lot of talk about fear. Fear in the system. A fear-based system where the professionals are fearful of getting into trouble, whether that's medico-legal or for not following guidance, and the idea that fear from midwives and obstetricians infects women. And this is definitely something I see parallels with in the UK. Women are fearful of birth. They read about maternity scandals in the press. And women then, as a result, do sometimes ask for intervention, such as a planned caesarean, as a way of controlling that fear. Others will opt for a home birth and maybe hire a doula as their way of managing that fear. But women are definitely in some ways losing trust in us and in that maternity system. And I do see that as a big problem. So having asked a lot of questions and raised a lot of problems, I was eager for the how. How are we going to achieve that wonderful aspirational aim of all women emerging physically well and emotionally safe from their births? And the answer came. The answer was continuity of care, investment in midwifery, in primary care models close to the woman's home, knowing her midwife. And that equally thrilled me and made me anxious. Absolutely, it's what we need. Absolutely knowing your midwife, telling your midwife everything, that midwife knowing that woman, knowing what is important to that woman, building trust with that woman. It makes a difference, not only quantitatively in the outcomes we see, there's lots of research to support it, but also qualitatively in how safe that woman feels in birthing her baby. They gave the shocking statistic that only 8% of women in Australia have midwifery-led care. That's unbelievably low, and in the UK we're much more fortunate. Tends to be around 30 to 35%. And we're on a national drive to improve continuity, which has been incrementally increasing since the publication of the Better Births National Maternity Review in 2015. They talked about the importance of that connection, that relationship, seeing the woman through that journey. And that if you don't have that connection, you get disassociation, so that the midwife then focus on tasks, not seeing and supporting that woman. And I can see that that's true. I observe it in my day-to-day work, and I work with several continuity of care teams. The reason the answer of continuity left me slightly dispirited is there wasn't much about how we're going to make that sustainable or large scale. They mentioned some small models of care with 30 midwives. And we in the UK are implementing continuity of care in a major way. But the models we're using are all sorts of different models. We're talking about continuity within a team, caseloading teams. So you may see a midwife from your team, but you may not actually know that named midwife. And that is an improvement from when you wouldn't know your midwife at all. And it is beneficial to the midwives. They find their jobs far more rewarding to be part of that close-knit team and really get to know the women they're caring for. But I can tell you, it's very difficult to sustain it. Midwives often have young children of their own. They may be part-time, they may be on maternity leave, they may come and go. So if you have a team of midwives of perhaps 6 to 8 midwives, then actually you may or may not know the one that happens to be on duty or the 2 that happen to be on duty when you come in and have your baby. And with some turnover in the team, it may be that even with a buddy midwife, you don't necessarily know that person. And equally, I know some midwives who've left continuity of care teams because they feel it's not a model that they can sustain with their own home and their own family and the work-life balance that comes with it. As I mentioned, we've been implementing this since 2015, so we're still in the relatively early stages. And we haven't yet got to the point where we have all women on a continuity of care pathway. What are we going to do when all women are having this care? Will we be able to sustain it? Will we see increasing numbers of midwives leaving due to burnout? We already have significant problems with retaining midwives. And I know there are some wonderful resources and sharing of ideas and continuity of care hubs and discussion forums and a national programme. And indeed, I've done some work with different maternity services on continuity. But for me, I would have liked a little bit more on how we make continuity of care models work for midwives. Maybe it's about staffing, maybe it's about having sufficient resources to have sufficient midwives so that the intensity isn't quite so much. Perhaps that's the answer. They did talk a little bit about how the idea of giving funding to women, and that was tried out as part of the National Maternity Review, the idea of personal maternity budgets so that a woman could choose and they could decide where they were going and therefore where their money went. It was refreshing at one point for someone to say the solution was not us and them between midwives and obstetricians, because in parts the film very much felt like obstetricians were the bad guys, and the only way forward is certainly really close collaboration. There were 2 descriptions to end with that I really liked. One was the idea of a midwife as a guide, guiding a woman on her journey, giving her information, acting as a sounding board, interfacing with obstetricians, paediatricians, and whoever else might be necessary, but being by her side, guiding her through the pregnancy, birth, and beyond. And I very much liked that idea. There was also a fantastic description by a partner. He said, be the board for her to reflect off. Let her take the lead. Love her through it. And I thought that was a really wonderful description of the role of a birth partner. And there was a slight tinge of sadness about our ability as women to stand up for ourselves. If I couldn't stand up for myself as an obstetrician working in healthcare, if I couldn't say I didn't want Syntocin on, if I couldn't say I didn't want an epidural, if I couldn't say I'm important and what I want is important, then how can I expect other people to be able to do that when they're less well versed with the system they're going into? At the end, what is my zesty bit? What am I taking away? I think one of the messages of the film is to advocate for more funding for maternity services and more priority to be given to maternity and birth and those first few months of life. And I absolutely get behind that. I have been thinking for a very long time that this is what determines the whole health of our population. So advocating for good quality, women-centred maternity services, absolutely. If you're a pregnant woman listening to this, I think my view would be, yes, watch this. Yes, be open-minded about it, but educate yourself. Try and get as much information about the choices that are being given to you. Try and ask questions. Try and make sure you're being given the information you need to make your decisions, and think of that midwife as your guide. And when you're told to perhaps do something or advised to do something by your doctors and midwives, don't be frightened to question it. It's okay to ask questions and understand on what basis they're giving you that information. And it's also okay to ask for time to think about it before you make a decision. And you can talk to your birth partners too about this approach and make sure that they have the right information so they can support you at times when perhaps you're unable to articulate things yourself. As a healthcare professional, would I watch Birth Time? Yes, I think it's a very good resource for reflecting on our own individual practice. Was it groundbreaking for me? No, but that's probably because I've thought about quite a lot of the issues before. However, I still have learnt and taken away something new. So yes, I think it's definitely a useful resource to watch, reflect on, think about, discuss with colleagues. There you have it. And my final little bit is I just can't think about the title Birth Time without thinking bath time. Bath time was such an important moment in my kids' lives when they were little, and I used to come home for bath time, and for some reason all the time I was watching Birth Time I was thinking bath time, possibly because a lot of the women were having the most wonderful water births. So that's my little maybe blooper reel. Bath time, birth time, brilliant time. I do hope you've enjoyed listening to this episode of the theobspod. Feel free to contact me on Twitter at FWmaternity or at theobspod to ask me questions, give me topics for future episodes, or let me know what you think. It's absolutely fantastic when you get in touch. I really enjoy reading your comments. As usual, I've tried to include in the programme notes some extra reading about this particular topic, both for professionals working in maternity care and for pregnant women using services. I'd like to reassure you that although I'm talking about my experiences working in maternity care, I take confidentiality very seriously and do not give any personal information about any of my patients. If you've enjoyed listening, I'd love you to recommend the theobspod to friends or colleagues, and please do leave me a review on whichever podcast directory you find my episodes. Many thanks for listening.